There you go. Okay.
Thank you so much, Brian. I am really delighted to be there with you and your students today. I am sorry the world is in such a state that I cannot be there in person with you. I would have loved to travel to Nazarbayev University and meet you and your students in person. It would have been an extraordinary experience. But the world is such right now that that's not possible. And so I thank you for inviting me. I look forward to hearing from your students. I do hope you'll actually raise your hands and speak if you feel comfortable, because I'd like to hear from you directly. It's also, I want to say, a great pleasure to have been invited by Brian Smith. Brian is one of my first students to go on to get his PhD and enter into the world of academia. So if any of you ever become teachers yourselves, you will know what a pleasure it is to see a student who has moved on in their career so successfully. And I've heard wonderful things about the work that you all do together there at Nazarbayev University, and I'm very glad to be a part of your activities today. So what Brian said is true. I teach philosophy. I'm not a political scientist or a specialist in IR. And so what I hope I can do for you today is touch upon those aspects of political theory which do connect with the work of your department. And by doing so, I hope to provide a sense of the choices that face us in the midst of what I do think is the current crisis for the world. So let me see if I can get this moving. So I will be moving quite quickly through my talk so that we can have time for conversation. So if anything strikes you that you'd like me to go back to, I can certainly do that in the question and answer period. So what is this crisis that's in the title of my talk? I think there's both a surface and a depth to that crisis. And the surface of the crisis is clearly Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the implications of that invasion for global security and the global economy. There's also, to my mind, a depth to the crisis, and it's best formulated as a question rather than a statement. What has brought us to this moment when the global political order in place since the end of World War II seems on the verge of collapse? And I want to qualify that statement. Of course, there have been wars, terrible wars, since the end of World War II. From my country's perspective, Vietnam, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but there has not been warfare on the scale of world war for over 70 years, but we seem like we're on the verge of that now. How might philosophy, therefore, especially political philosophy, help clarify the choices facing us in this crisis? And who is this us? Who are we in this era of global crisis? And in my view, the depth of the crisis has to do with this who are we question. And that will connect up with the other themes of my talk today. Are we, all human beings across the globe, united by a common humanity? Are we defined as citizenry of nation states, the Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, the United States, and so on? Are we defined by various kinds of identity, racial, ethnic? In Kazakhstan, as best I understand, the major ethnicities are Kazakh, Russian, Uzbek, German, and others. Are we defined by our religious identity as Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, and if Christian, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and so on? Are we defined politically? Conservative or liberal, right-wing or left-wing, capitalist, socialist, communist, democratic, or authoritarian? Who is this we facing the crisis of this global era? So as far as our identity goes and the status of the we who is at issue, I think our identities are multiply determined. They are national, ethnic, religious, political, and so on. And so the question is, what is most relevant to this crisis, both on the surface and its depths, in terms of who we are that face this crisis? And I think the key to that is that this is, in fact, a global crisis. And therefore, it affects us as a global humanity, from the citizens of the most cosmopolitan cities to the most remote tribes people of the Amazon forests, for the following interlocking reasons. First is the integration of the global economy, including and above all, food security, water security, energy security. Especially the first and the third of those are threatened by the war in Ukraine. The wheat supplies are already in danger, and that can create enormous insecurity across the globe. And of course, energy security is equally a problem. Then there's the integration of global information and communication, including commerce, knowledge production. And then there are the implications of modern technological advances that are also global. Apocalyptic military destruction, most obviously in the case of global nuclear war, which is a danger in this current conflict. Global climate change, which is now a global crisis, and if we do not act quickly, soon to be a global catastrophe. So in my view, we are, all of us, sharing a global fate. We cannot escape confronting the global crisis as one we share as a global humanity, as the first and foremost feature of our identity as human beings and who we are. We either face this crisis together or we face apart the prospect that this century will be a century when a global humanity commits a global suicide. So, liberalism. My title is Liberalism, Heidegger, and Fascism. Let me say a word or two about my understanding of liberalism and its corruption into neoliberalism. So I'll start with the ideals of traditional classical liberalism. And this is a very rough outline of some of the features that I see in classical liberalism. They include human nature as universal, timeless, and at least potentially good. Human rights as natural, prior, and superior to any particular governmental form. Liberty, and hence liberalism, as the foundational right. Individualism as the ethic of personal freedom and robust responsibility. Consent as the basis for any legitimate form of government. Popular sovereignty as the mode of consent in representative democracy. Patriotism as the civic virtue of an engaged and vigilant people. Constitutional rule as how the body politic organizes state power. The separation of powers into executive, legislative, and judicial to prevent abuse of power. The rule of law as superior to the rule of human beings, that no one is above the law, that all are equal before the law. private property to ensure personal autonomy and independence, and commerce and a market economy to promote common prosperity. So that's an idealistic view of a version of classical liberalism. I think one that many in the West would subscribe to as what they think, or at least hope, their political communities are about. But what about the reality of liberalism in the world today? And I put a question mark at the end of this because I think this is contested, deeply contested. But I think in neoliberalism, human nature is mostly conceived as something subject to manipulation and greed. Human rights are a cover for cultural, political, and economic imperialism or neocolonialism and hegemony. Liberty corrupted into license, a will to domination, exploitation, self-indulgence, individualism as an ethic of consumerism and communal alienation, consent as manufactured by propaganda and marketing, popular sovereignty as a political mask for the private interest of oligarchs, patriotism degenerated into nationalism and polarization, constitutional rule as a convenient cover for oligarchic rule, separation of powers as a basis for governmental paralysis and misrule, the rule of law as a weapon to serve the interests of the rich and powerful, private property as a mechanism to ignore the common good, and commerce and markets to promote a monopoly on capital by elites. Certainly that is a very live criticism of neoliberalism as we've seen it in the world today. So I put these two side by side here. We can return to this as a comparison. This is a somewhat more condensed version of that side by side comparison. And now I want to talk about the complicity of the West in the current crisis that we see unfolding in the Ukraine. I'm going to mark some dates: the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the breakup of the Soviet Union into its constituent republics in 1991. And Vladimir Putin on these events was very clear what his views are. In 1999, he said, for the first time in the past 200 to 300 years, Russia faces the real danger that it could be relegated to the second or even the third tier of global powers. And in his 2005 State of the Union address, he said, first and foremost, it is worth acknowledging that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And he says, tens of millions of our fellow citizens found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. And so he defines Russia in terms of the Russian people. It's an ethnic definition of who we are. In 1989, the American political scientist wrote a very famous essay called The End of History. And it's also often forgotten that the actual title of that had a question mark included in it. He saw it as a question. But for him, the end of history, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, indicated that perhaps, maybe, history had ended in the decisive favor of liberalism. And so Western triumphalism, in my view, plausibly led to a kind of neoliberal corruption on the global scale. There was a refusal to allow Russia, the former Soviet republics, or Warsaw Pact nations to engage in a managed transition from communism to capitalism. As that was what Gorbachev wanted, and he was not respected on that. The West turns a blind eye to unmediated transition from communism. And that led former communist elites to either be humiliated by the loss of their national identity, or to appropriate state capital for themselves, producing kleptocratic capitalism and oligarchy. And there was a failure to regulate capitalism and Western investment in the Soviet bloc. And most crucially, that failure to regulate was mirrored by deregulation of banking, financial markets, real estate investment, and so on in the West, which meant that the West welcomed the transfer by oligarchs of vast capital from the former Soviet Union into investments in real estate, shell companies, and other domains. And there was an increasing corruption in the West by this infusion of kleptocratic wealth. And there was intense blowback of neoliberalism onto the West. Global capitalism and the deregulation of finance, banking, and real estate in the West has led to the nearly catastrophic economic collapse of 2008, the disruption of domestic labor markets as manufacturing moves to cheaper labor abroad, which has led to popular discontent in the first world, accelerating degradation of the environment and unchecked global climate change, and an unwillingness or inability of Western democracies to effectively address these crises. So there's a crisis in the West, not just in Ukraine. There's a rise of populist and neo-nationalist politics, Berlusconi in Italy, Johnson, Britain, Le Pen in France, Orban in Hungary, and so on. There's been the descent of the American Republican Party into far-right populism and post-truth politics. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 in the United States after an exceptionally divisive far-right ethno-nationalist campaign, and a refusal of the Republican Party to take seriously Russia's interference in the 2016 election in Trump's favor, Trump's own closeness to Putin, and Trump's undermining of NATO and Ukraine itself. And finally, Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election and the attempted coup of January 6, 2021 at the Stop the Steal rally and riot in Washington, D.C., which led to an invasion of the US Capitol to prevent the counting of the presidential ballots, the ballots for the presidential campaign. So that's the attempted coup on January 6th. This was promoted and, in my view, orchestrated by Donald Trump and those around him. And there's some elements of those events that day that I will touch back upon in a moment, just to illustrate. So part 4 is on fascisms and neo-fascisms, the other title in my, the other term in my title. And so I want to first present a rough taxonomy of what we in the West call the alt-right or the new right. Alt-right stands for the alternative right, and what I call the nationalist international. So the new right is an eclectic mix of reactionary ideologies that generally reject progressive universalism and bourgeois capitalism, but ostensibly reject the totalitarian party politics, imperialism, and genocide of the old right. It encompasses the alt-right, which is the tech and media savvy mutation of the new right, often postmodern in its social networking, its Dadaist humor and owning the libs, intermingled with identitarianism, which is a new right appropriation of progressive identity politics, focusing on white identity, at least in Europe and in the United States. Ethno-nationalism, white nationalism, white supremacy, Neofascism, it's getting worse and worse, and fascism. So I'm defining Neofascism as simply the adaptation of fascism to present historical and cultural contingencies. So reactionary, authoritarian rejection of Enlightenment universalism and liberalism, embracing identity grounded in atavistic belonging that can generally only be discovered, not chosen, and that is exclusive, usually aggressively, even violently so, and that typically rejects rule of law, limited government, and human rights, and generally puts its faith in a supreme leader who represents the will of the nation. And I will talk a little bit about neo-confederacy, which is an American version of fascism. So these are just some portraits of these various forms: identitarianism, ethno-nationalism, white supremacy, fascism, neo-fascism, and neo-confederacy. This is a photograph from the invasion of our Congress on January 6th of last year during the attempted coup. Those of you who aren't Americans may not recognize this flag. It is the battle flag of the Confederate States of America from the American Civil War in the 19th century. It is an important emblem of the new right in America. So I wanted to say something about how liberalism is under threat in the West, and particularly in America today as well, in this form of neo-confederacy. Again, I'm not assuming you know that much about American history. The Confederate States here in the red separated from the United States in 1861, and we fought a civil war for 4 years to reunite the country. And it was a civil war fought over slavery, with the Confederacy representing the slavery interests. So here I just wanted to use as a model, this is the American Declaration of Independence, quite famous. And I wanted to compare it to a speech by Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy in 1861, as a statement of American proto-fascism versus American classical liberalism. So the Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish government when it abuses those rights." Versus the Confederacy. Speaking of these ideas, the Vice President Stephens said, "These ideas were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. Our new government, the Confederate States, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." So there is a split in the American identity that persists to this day around these two visions of what America could be. So the Confederate flag is a marker of white identity in contemporary American politics. I'm going to move quickly. This is a flag that was flying in Virginia in the United States in 2021. It shows a white hand removing the American flag to display the Confederate flag. It's an extraordinary symbol of an underlying pathology in the United States. So fascism and neo-fascism, and just to repeat my definition, this is a very rough and ready definition. So why Heidegger and the alt-right and the nationalist international? What does it have to do with him? So many of the thought leaders on the new right or alt-right draw on Heidegger or work directly on Heidegger. Far-right political leaders and activists, largely in Europe, but also in the United States and elsewhere, draw explicitly or indirectly from Heidegger. There is a non-trivial resonance between Heidegger's philosophical involvement with National Socialism. So, in case you don't know, Heidegger, very important German philosopher, lived from 1889 to 1976. And in 1933, he publicly joined the Nazi Party. He was a leader of his university and one of the most famous intellectual supporters of that movement. Confronting Heidegger on his politics may allow us to confront more fully and philosophically the rise of ethno-nationalism in the United States, Europe, and beyond, and confront the concomitant weaknesses of liberal democracy. I'm going to skip that point. So just to give some examples, in the United States, there's Greg Johnson. He has his PhD in philosophy from Catholic University. He's the editor-in-chief of Countercurrents Publishing. He's written many books of his own. He's translated into 16 languages. His website has 300,000 unique visitors monthly, and he has extensive nationalist international connections through Europe. And he writes books on Heidegger and takes Heidegger as his leading theorist. There's Richard Spencer in the United States, who claimed to have invented the term alt-right. He also had an education in philosophy and intellectual history. He is an avowed white nationalist. He advocates peaceful ethnic cleansing to create white ethnostates, and he organized the violent Unite the Right rally in the United States, which was a turning point in domestic politics here. Steve Bannon, co-founder of Breitbart News, as the platform for the alt-right. He has cited Julius Evola, the Russian neo-fascist Alexander Dugin, as influences on his own organicist traditionalism. Of Heidegger, he says, "That's my guy." He was the campaign director and then White House advisor to Donald Trump, the mentor of Stephen Miller. And he calls himself a right-wing Bolshevist. "I'm a Leninist. Lenin wanted to destroy the state, and that's my goal too. I want to bring everything crashing down and destroy all of today's establishment." Stephen Miller, one of Donald Trump's most long-lasting advisor, he wrote Trump's 2018 UN speech to the UN. I just wanted to excerpt this one passage. "America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism. Around the world, responsible nations must defend against threats to sovereignty, not just from global governance, but also from other new forms of coercion and domination." I see this as euphemistic language, but these words are nearly a paraphrase of Heidegger's speech in 1933 for the German plebiscite supporting Hitler, as we'll see. Martin Zellner in Austria, also a Heideggerian. Mark Jungen in the AfD party in Germany also wrote his dissertation on Heidegger. Alexander Dugin in Russia, not quite Putin's brain, but deeply immersed in Russian political and intellectual life, broadly active in the alt-right nationalist international across the world. He was the co-founder of the National Bolshevik Party in the 1990s, publishes extensively on Heidegger. And he supports the Russian conquest of the Ukraine, which he considers a non-existent nation and an accident of history. Olena Semenyake in the Ukraine, she's the first lady of the Azov Brigade, a Ukrainian neo-fascist paramilitary and political movement. She's working on a PhD on Heidegger and Ernst Jünger. She is also deeply connected with the Nationalist International. She did break with Dugin, who was a mentor of hers, after the Russia-Ukraine conflict 8 years ago. So a little bit more detail on Heidegger and the Nationalist International. This is Heidegger's speech in 1933 in defense of Hitler's national plebiscite. And that was a plebiscite asking the German people to approve of Hitler's domestic and foreign policy. And the foreign policy included leaving the League of Nations. Heidegger said, leaving the League of Nations is not turning away from the community of nations. On the contrary, with this step, our people is submitting to that essential law of human existence to which every people must first give allegiance if it is still to be a people. It is only out of the parallel observance by all peoples of this unconditional demand of self-responsibility that there emerges the possibility of taking one another seriously so that a community of nations can be affirmed. It is not ambition, not desire for glory, not blind obstinacy, and not hunger for power that demands from the Führer that Germany withdraw from the League of Nations. It is only the clear will to unconditional self-responsibility in enduring and mastering the fate of our people. I think that is directly resonant with Miller's speech that he wrote for Donald Trump in 2018. So to continue in that speech, the will to a true community of nations is equally far removed from an unrestrained, vague desire for world brotherhood and from blind tyranny. Excuse me. Existing beyond this opposition, this will allows peoples and states to stand by one another in an open and manly fashion as self-reliant entities. I'm going to skip ahead. For Heidegger, this will is the highest guarantee of security, for it binds itself to the basic law of manly respect and unconditional honor. And of course, none of that proved to be true. Adolf Hitler invaded his neighbors and precipitated a world war. And now I want to turn to Heidegger's more philosophical explanation. And this is, in my view, the most concentrated statement of his political thought. And this is in his critique of Plato as the foundation of Western thinking and the figure he sees most responsible for the degeneration of the West. And he says, if one interprets Plato's ideas as representations and thoughts that contain a value, a norm, a rule, such that ideas then become conceived of as norms, then the one subject to these norms is the human being, not the historical human being, but rather the human being in general, the human being in itself or humanity. Here, that is, in Platonism, in all its forms, which includes almost everything from Christianity to Hegel to Marx for Heidegger, the conception of the human being is one of a rational being in general. In the Enlightenment and in liberalism, this conception achieves a definite form. Here, all the powers against which we, that is Germany under National Socialism, must struggle today have their root. Opposed to this conception are the finitude, temporality, and historicity of human beings. So let me say a word about this. I think the key issue here is, oh, sorry, I can't do that in this text, is Plato's ideas. So Plato is famous for his doctrine of ideas, or the forms, and Heidegger is criticizing this as responsible for the idea that what it means to be human, most fully human, has to be understood not historically, not as a feature of what it means to belong to a finite temporal culture and history, but that what it means to be human is something abstract, general, universal. So to be human is to be a part of a universal humanity. And that is what Heidegger is opposing, and it is what he sees as the core concept of liberalism. I don't think he's wrong about it being a core concept of liberalism. It's just that I don't reject it as he does. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but Plato is the beginning of idealism in philosophy and in political philosophy. The idea that the idea of the idea and of the ideal as what it is that we should be aiming for in our ethical and political lives, something that transcends the temporal, the finite, the historical. So for Heidegger, what this means is that instead of liberalism, we need a multiculturalism between nations, but not within them. It is precisely this conceit of an anti-universalist community of nations in the nationalist international that the modern new right has latched onto in its reading of Heidegger. At its most subtle, this position can present itself as an appeal to distinct identity without relying on race, only on the right of each historical people to the self-assertion of its own ethno-identity within a bounded territory. It is what allows Greg Johnson, for example, to proclaim that we believe that all peoples should have sovereign homelands where they can live according to their own lights, free from the interference of other people, or Richard Spencer to claim that this respectful separation might be achieved by peaceful ethnic cleansing. And I simply invite you to imagine how unlikely it is that we would have peaceful ethnic cleansing in such a politics. So this is Greg Johnson taking up Heidegger. Heidegger's conclusion is that all cognitive activities, even those of philosophy and science, are made possible by language and other social practices that are learned ultimately by participation in a community that is particular, not universal, changing, not eternal, provincial, not cosmopolitan. In other words, at the very root of every cognitive act is ethnic identity. In Heidegger's words, I believe there is no essential work of the spirit that does not have its root in originary autochthony. In other words, being rooted to the land as a distinct people. Thus, contrary to Plato and other Greek philosophers, deracination, that is, escape from the cave of finitude into a universal, timeless domain, is not the path to wisdom, but the path to the folly of nihilism, which is playing itself out today on the global stage. And I'm running out of time, but I was going to use as my other example Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory. And I'm going to rush through these slides a little bit. For Dugin takes up Heidegger's claim that to overcome the crisis of modernity, we have to overturn Plato's universalism in all of its forms, including Christianity and so on. And this fourth political theory transcends the three preceding ones, liberalism, communism, and fascism. He thinks each of these in its own way elevated a conception of the human being as the agent of politics that only made our situation worse. The isolated individual in liberalism, the class and class consciousness in communism, with the proletariat as the class to end all classes. In fascism, the race or the state as the embodiment of the race. And he argued that National Socialism or Nazism could be purged of its racism and domesticated and made a positive political ideology in the fourth political theory, with a positive attitude towards the ethnos and ethnocentrism that can be rescued from historical fascism. So for Heidegger, for Dugin, Heidegger is the best philosophical basis for the ontology of the ethnic identity of a people. So Dugin writes that liberalism as an ideology, calling for the liberation from all forms of collective identity in general, is entirely incompatible with the ethnos and ethnocentrism. It is an expression of systematic, theoretical, and technological ethnocide. So this is the basis for Putin claiming that, Dugin claiming that that Russia represents a decolonialist championing of Eurasianism against Western liberalism, or what Dugin calls Atlanticism, and that Russia and those allied with it must combat liberalism as a form of global imperialism. So decolonialism is a theme of the alt-right. They've taken this from the left and made it their own. And I'm going to move quickly against this. Dugin is arguing for what he calls pluriversalism against liberal universalism. Again, I'm going to just jump over this. I focused on Dugin because he's a Russian thinker who's adopted Heidegger, and that strikes me as important for the present crisis that we're facing. But I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move forward. My point about Dugin, though, is that he is a neo-fascist, and this is the logo of his National Bolshevik Party, which he founded in the 1990s. And he takes that logo directly from the Reichsadler of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. So he is a good example of how neo-fascism repackages historical fascism for contemporary political purposes. Using my previous definitions of neoliberalism, I think those 12 categories can easily slide into neo-fascism. It is a fear that I have even for my own country, the United States, after the presidency of Donald Trump. And I can return to this slide if anyone is interested, but I think you can see the aspects of it that I find most distressing. And now I come to part 7, and I'm really just going to go back to my slide here on liberalism versus neoliberalism and ask if there is a way forward. I still see this as a question facing all of us. Is there a way to reconcile the ideals of classical liberalism with the crisis that faces us as a global humanity? And that crisis includes both the universalism of classical liberalism and the sense that human communities have across the globe that their own identities, historical, religious, and so on, is something that needs to be preserved. How can we have both? How can we have both universalism and identity in an age of global crisis? And I leave that as a question rather than go on with my talk so that we can have a conversation. And I'll stop the share there and take your questions.
Okay, thank you. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, you can raise your hand or.
Do we have only one person here with us?
Oh, there's Sanjar. Okay, yes,
Hello,
please.
Sanjar.
Yes, hi. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, okay, thank you. So in the general, we can see the historic trend that the economic downturn and general economic turmoil leads to extremism, be it fascism or communism, far left or far right. So can you say that in American politics there is a significant economic problems that had led to the rise of alt-right in the past years and leading to the Trump's presidency, especially
Absolutely.
in the South and the Midwest regions of America?
Yes, I think so. And that's why I say that the West bears some of the blame, maybe a great deal of the blame for the current crisis, because neoliberalism places the interests of the market ahead of everything else. And what that has meant in the United States is the migration of a great deal of our industrial capacity outside of the United States to China most preeminently. And that has caused enormous economic dislocation for American workers and the middle class, especially in industrial regions. And I think their sense of desperation has led them to a figure like Donald Trump as a savior from the effects of neoliberal capitalism.
A follow-up question to that in the chat is, do you have a sense of what economic goals unite white nationalists in the USA and Europe?
They generally both are hostile to unrestrained neoliberal capitalism. So the alt-right and ethno-nationalists are not traditional capitalists, even though they are very conservative by American standards. What's very different about this is that in the United States, conservatism used to be very closely tied to the free markets, deregulation of the markets, and so on. ethno-nationalism is not interested in free markets. And I think that's something that the ethno-nationalists of Europe and the United States share. It's a complicated relationship, though, politically, because ethno-nationalists need to make common cause with more traditional conservatives in order to obtain political power. And so in the United States, you see a clash between traditional Republicans and Trump supporters. And Trump has largely won that fight. Whether that will remain the case over the next 2 years, we don't know, but the fate of the United States depends on that struggle between ethno-nationalism as represented by Donald Trump and more traditional neoliberal conservatism in the United States.
Okay,
I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Magjan?
Magjan.
Yes.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Professor Fred, Professor Smith. Thank you for organizing this lecture. And Professor Fred, I'm quite confused with the one slide you've showed about when talking about Dugin's red-brown neo-fascist and comparing it to classical fascism and calling it neo-fascist. So are you, when you say neo-fascism, do you mean also neo-Nazi, or is there any kind of differentiation between the neo-Nazism and neo-fascism? Because for me personally, the fascism and Nazism, they might be very unique, ideological thing for many people, but they are different for me. And I would like to clarify whether Dugin is neo-Nazi or neo-fascist.
I think it's very difficult because part of the neo-fascist movement, an aspect of it is a very fluid use of ideology. So I'm just going to return to one of my slides that I went over very, very quickly, just so I can illustrate what I mean. Can you see my screen now, everybody?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so Magjan, these aren't Dugin's symbols. These are symbols from the United States far right. These people here on the left of my screen are members of the alt-right political movement, neo-fascist movement, at a rally in the United States, the Unite the Right rally, which resulted in enormous violence. And you can see here, they're bearing all different kinds of symbols. And these are some other versions of those symbols that we've seen on the alt-right in the United States. It's a huge variety of symbols that if you know something about fascism, you understand them as fascist symbols, but to an outsider are very hard to understand. So neo-fascism will sometimes adopt Nazi symbolism. For example, this one, this green flag here at the bottom, this is a flag used in the United States, also in Europe, you see it sometimes, but it is modeled on the Nazi war flag. But no one who doesn't know that would see it, so they can fly it without necessarily bringing on controversy. And I think this is what we see, Magjan, is that these groups will go into the ideologies of the past, whether it's fascist or Nazi or white supremacist, and pick and choose what serves their present interests. But it is frequently very mobile in terms of what kind of ideological point or what kind of symbolism they will employ in the political sphere. So Dugin himself calls himself a national Bolshevist, which means some kind of compromise between the aims of communism, namely opposition to capitalism, and fascism, which means renouncing communism's universal goals. I mean, remember, Marx's final words in the Communist Manifesto were "workers of the world unite." That is a universalist conception of human nature. But for Dugin, national Bolshevism means communism with an ethnocentric, non-universal perspective. Does that help answer your question, Mark-Jean?
Well, I gained a lot of detail, thank you. And now I just need to revalue them and go through and through. I mean, it's not possible to make a finite opinion on such complicated phenomena just by hearing some arguments. So it'll take quite time to me to completely understand what you've said. I hope that the recorded lecture will be shared by the emails. And I have another question, if I may, please.
Of course.
I want to say in advance that I don't mean to offend you, but during your presentation, hadn't you paid too much attention on the Confederacy flag in the southern states? I mean, for the last 150 years, it was okay to see them flying over the houses or any other buildings in the southern states. I just want to clarify it.
Yeah. You don't offend me. You're from a completely different country as mine, and it's a reasonable question, because I do think that for many generations, the Confederate flag, or at least what we see as the Confederate flag, is actually the flag that was used in battle by the Confederacy. It wasn't the actual national flag, but that has its own meaning as well. That it's the battle flag, the war flag of the Confederacy. So that flag in the American South was readopted in the 1950s and incorporated into state flags in the South and flown over the state capitals in the South as a reaction to and defiance of progress on civil rights for Black Americans. During the civil rights movement in the United States, which really only began strongly in the 1950s and then into the 1960s, there was enormous opposition, especially in the southern states, but not only in the southern states, to equality, to, the ideal of American liberalism is that all men are created equal, and not just all men, all human beings are created equal. The Confederate flag represents an absolute rejection of that idea. And so in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was used again to oppose equality for non-white Americans. And that's why it's used by supporters of Donald Trump. That's why a man brought the Confederate flag into the United States Capitol in the attack on January 6, 2021. The United States fought a civil war against that flag, and it finally broke into the Capitol of the United States. That has symbolic meaning. So for many years, that symbolic meaning was repressed and denied. It was used just as a design. It wasn't taken very seriously, except by people who took it very seriously. But for Black Americans, that flag means white supremacy. they were never under any illusion of what that flag means. It means white supremacy.
Okay, I understand. Thank you very much again.
And there are books written about this. So there's a book called Neo-Confederacy. I invite you to take a look at it and read it. But it is a powerful movement now in the United States. You see the Confederate flag, not just in the South, but all over this country now, as a symbol of a kind of ethno-nationalism in support of Donald Trump.
Yeah, actually, talking about the books, I've read the book of T. Marshall called Flags and What They Mean and Ideologies. And there was a chapter like devoted to the American flags, the lines and stripes. And there was a sub chapter about the Confederacy flag and its meaning about like 13 southern states in a round, claiming that they're equal and so on. But there wasn't any details about supremacy and other stuff. So probably I should take a look.
When was that book written? When was that book?
2016, I believe. But Tim Mitchell, he is British, so probably he didn't know about the details in southern states of the US.
Yeah, I think the Confederate flag is often used as a pop culture symbol outside of the United States of rebellion, sort of romanticizing the rebel, right? I don't know if that rings true with you, but that is one of the ways that is entered into popular culture, is as a symbol of rebellion against central authority. But that ignores its real cultural history in the United States as a symbol of white supremacy, which is its most significant political meaning, not just its pop culture meaning.
I understood, sir. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for your questions. I appreciate it. Sanjar, or is there, you've had a question, but go ahead.
Yeah, but I actually wanted to ask a follow-up question to that, to my previous question of economic turmoils. So right now, the Europe, as one of our professors have previously stated, has basically waged an economic war against Russia by blocking any kind of significant transactions of capital to and from the Russia base, and all the multinational corporations are being pulling out of Russia, and this is deeply hurting the Russian economy. So what I'm trying to say is, right now, the nationalist views in the Russian society are rising and rising considerably. And does the economic problems in Russia actually deepen these nationalist situations? And might European policy and also Western policy of waging economic war backfire, basically, and create even more resentful Russian populace, such as like playing parallel with the Weimar Republic of the Germany? Yes.
Well, I'm not a prophet, so I can't tell you for sure, but what you've described is obviously a danger. It is the gamble that the United States and Europe is making in order to resist the invasion of Ukraine. So it's a choice that's been made instead of war, instead of military war. And the idea is, and this does connect with my point that the West shares in the blame for this. The West has invested in Russia and turned a blind eye to its ambitions. The gamble is that the Russian people will withdraw support rather than become more patriotic because of this. I don't know that we have good data on what the sanctions are doing to the attitude of the Russian people yet. I've heard both ways, that it is deep, that there's deep Russian opposition to this war, but that there's also patriotic support of this war. I think it will make a difference if many Russian young men come home dead, as it did in the war in Afghanistan, and it will make a difference if the Russian economy collapses. The other goal is to prevent Putin from having the economic resources to continue this war. But it's dangerous, I agree with you. The world is in real crisis, Sanjar. The alternative would be to let Putin have his way and take over Ukraine. The question then would be, where would he stop? Because Putin has made it very clear that he wants to restore the former Soviet empire as much as he possibly can. That includes the Baltic states, that includes the old Warsaw Pact. Will he really just stop with the Ukraine? I don't think so. So what do we do? I think that the measures taken now are the most reasonable ones so far to address the military crisis. But the crisis is much larger than just the military crisis. It's an economic crisis, but it's also a crisis in our conception of who we think we are as a global humanity. Is this a problem we all share, or is it Russia's problem and Ukraine's problem, but not China's problem, not Brazil's problem, not America's problem, not South Africa's problem? I think it's all our problem, this crisis, which is not only the Ukraine. There were other hands. I thought, is there a woman named Amina here?
Amina, yes.
Tesanova?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. So can you hear me?
I can hear you, but sadly I can't see you. That's okay.
Okay then. Thank you for the presentation. I'd like to so in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the point about Western triumphalism, and
yes.
So there was a point about refusal to allow Russian and former Soviet republics to engage in a transition from communism to capitalism. So I wanted you to expand on that point. So can you tell what you mean by refusal to allow them this transition, but also what, in your opinion, could have been done by the European nations and by the West to make that transition go smoothly? Or do they have to do that at all?
Well, they don't have to do it, but then they have to face the consequences of not having done it. I'm not an economist. I'm not an international relations specialist. I'm not a historian, but I'll do my best to give you an answer, and it would have to be very broad, Amina. But my understanding is this: in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, Russia and these other nations were in very, very dire, difficult economic circumstances. And Gorbachev, for example, wanted the West, the United States especially, to provide loans and other forms of economic guarantees that would have allowed a slower transition from communism to some form of market economy, right? capitalism has many forms, right? And some of them are much more laissez-faire and neoliberal than others. There's a difference between the capitalism of the United States and Russia and the capitalism of Sweden and Denmark. So what George Bush insisted was that Russia simply had to take the aid that the United States was offering on the terms that they would open their economy up to foreign investment and an unregulated capitalism. And what that meant was that people who are in a position because of their previous positions in the communist hierarchy, they could buy up the state resources or take control of those state resources and make use of them in the new capitalist economy, but without a transition that would serve what I see as the purposes of an economy in classical liberalism. The purpose of the economy in classical liberalism is to serve the common good of the people. And you can have a market economy, you can have capitalism, but it has to be a capitalism that allows for freedom, for consent of the governed, for democratic representation, and for some kind of reasonably equitable distribution of the goods of the nation. Instead, what we see happening is a kleptocracy where the wealth of Russia is being deposited in Swiss bank accounts and in Trump's real estate in New York City. That's not in the interests of the Russian people. And that was a terrible mistake, that we didn't have a slower transition to a market economy in Russia and other countries so that the market economy could be more properly distributed without monopolies and the consolidation of power by oligarchs. And I'm not enough of an economist and political scientist to tell you how that could have and should have happened. I just think it would have been possible, or at least we should have tried much harder to do that. And I think we let the Russian people down by not doing that.
Okay, we have Magjan, a follow-up.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so I don't have a question, but I have a rather free ad intervention and advice to Amina to watch the lecture of Vladimir Posner, Russian journalist, given at University of Yale, called How the US Created Vladimir Putin, because it touches some points of why the US did not made an aid to the post-Soviet republics, not from recovering from the collapse of communism and the more gradual transition into the market economy.
You know, Russia has enormous potential economically, that has great wealth in its land. And I think the West was greedy. They saw the potential for investment and enormous returns in oil and gas and minerals. And they were willing to do business with whomever could control those resources in Russia. I think that was a terrible, terrible mistake.
Okay, so there are two questions in the chat that maybe you can see, Greg.
I have to open the chat. I was looking at. Which can you?
So,
who
hi,
are they
Professor.
by?
Very glad to have you with us. The American alt-right activists like to. Do you see that one?
Yeah, like to pretend that fascism and Nazism are the same thing. This is Logan. Thank you, Logan. As historical communism and Marxism, because they claim they both were state command economies. They refuse to read Marx, for example, to even understand the basic differences. How do you best explain the difference to all our frustrating uncles? That's a great question. Thank you. So it's an interesting question, because you're putting your finger on something that the alt-right does in the United States and in Europe. They try to deny that they're the same thing as these movements from 70 or 80 years ago, that they're not going to be centralized totalitarian parties with control over the economy and all of that. That the model they use is the new left against the old left, right? So the old left's criticism, the new left's criticism of the old left was that it was Stalinist and Leninist and party control and so on, whereas the new left was going to be much more diverse and pluralistic and respectful of differences and so on. And the new right is trying to claim the same thing, but just on the right rather than on the left. I don't buy it. I think it's delusional. And I think the most obvious aspect of that delusion, or maybe it's not even a delusion, a simple lie, is the idea that we can have peaceful ethnic cleansing to create ethnostates. I mean, we saw how well that worked in the former Yugoslavia. And if you calculate the casualties of the Yugoslav civil war and project that onto the United States with peaceful ethnic cleansing to create white ethnostates in the United States, it would be, 10 million dead. So it's either insanity or just lying. Now, I'm not sure, Logan, what you mean by your frustrating uncles. I assume it means ones who lived through communism and still have some lingering affection for the ideals of communism. Is that fair to say? No?
In this case, they're drawing upon Hayek and who's the other guy, Jonah Goldberg, and they'll basically try to do this, square the circle, and say that, well, actually, the entire state was a command economy under Hitler, and that's the defining feature of the communist system, and ergo facto, voila, they're all the same. And actually, the Tysons weren't in charge. They're not all the same. They're not all the same, but the Tysons weren't in charge. The Tysons weren't relevant. The Nazis weren't capitalists, etc. Therefore, they're all the same.
It is, yeah. You see a similar dynamic in the conflict within the contemporary right-wing movements and Republican Party in the United States. As I mentioned, traditional Republicans are for a very free economy, low regulation, minimal state, the Hayek libertarian view of the state. But Trumpism is much more complicated than that. Of course, Trump is a capitalist, but he's a klepto-capitalist, much like we see in Russia. And his movement wants to interfere with aspects of capitalism. For example, the free movement of labor. Traditional capitalism is perfectly happy with the free movement of labor, right? Even if it causes disruption among the workers of your own nation, right? Contemporary Republicans are in favor of protectionism for American labor. Trump was very happy to impose tariffs and so on. So National Socialism was not communistic, but it was very happy to interfere with conventional capitalism when there were state interests involved. But that didn't mean it had turned away capitalism. It just was, it was subordinate to the nationalist interest. And I think we see the same thing in Russia and potentially in the United States if Donald Trump wins again. So it's our problem too.
Okay, so
that's why I take responsibility for it as an American, in part. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay, there's one more chat question beneath that, and we'll see if there's any remaining in the last few minutes.
Is that, how do I pronounce that? Ziat?
Ziat?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Fried, for this lecture. What is the best strategy for the West, do you think, when and if Putin's regime falls? Do you think anything close to the Marshall Plan is possible for Russia? Are neoliberal elites in the West capable of making such moves? Well, again, there are a lot of ifs in that question. My personal view is that Russians have nothing to fear from the West. So long as the West acts with responsibility for the economy of Russia in a transitional period. And the reason I say that Russians have no reason to fear the West is that let's not forget that Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And yet Ukraine would like to be part of the EU, would even like to be part of NATO, and does not feel that its national interests are endangered by that. I think if you're studying international relations, the most important question to ask is this. A realist in international relations would say Russia has essential interests that make it by necessity an adversary to Europe and the United States. That there could be no global solution where the Russian nation was not an adversary of the West. I don't believe that. I think Russia is an adversary of the West because the oligarchy in Russia needs to be an adversary of the West in order to keep the Russian people down. And if the Russian people were more in control of their politics and their economy, it could be like how Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia have been integrating into the Western world. I don't see why that is a threat to Russia. But the Western world has to clean its own house as well to prevent this kind of oligarchic poison that we suffer from as well. Not as seriously, but it is becoming very serious. And we see that in the figure of Donald Trump. We nearly lost our democracy a year ago in America. It was very close. So we should not be triumphalist in the West. We should recognize what our weaknesses are too, and be more modest and humble in trying to come to a future that makes sense for all of us. That's what I pray for. That's what I hope for. I don't know if it'll happen, but I think it's possible. There's one new message. Oh, thank you. You're welcome.
All right, well, we're at the very end of our allotted time. Is there any final question before we log off? This will be recorded for those who, this has been recorded for those who want to view it at a later time. Anyone else?
And what I'll say is if you do have questions, you can email them to Professor Smith and he'll send them to me and I'll try to answer them. I also have a paper, which isn't exactly this talk, but I can send that paper to Professor Smith and he can share it with anybody who would like to see it. I thank you all very much. I appreciate your questions. Again, I do wish I could have been there in person. I would have loved to see your country and meet you in person, but we'll leave that for the next time.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to turn the record off